So welcome to so this is a continuation of last spring's lecture series. So we started last spring with talks on the Eucharist, and we looked at Christ's purpose in instituting the Eucharist, and we saw that there were three fundamental purposes for the Eucharist. Not just, so it's the greatest treasure of the Church because it contains Christ's presence. So it's the presence of the Lord in our midst, even after He's ascended into heaven. So that's the first reason. And if that were the only reason, it would have been enough to make the Eucharist the greatest treasure of the Church, because it's the Lord. But He doesn't stop there. He also, that presence He gives to us to be our spiritual nourishment. And that's Holy Communion, so that we receive most intimately into us that very Lord who's made Himself present. And we'll look at that in the last part of the lecture series. We'll look at Holy Communion. But for this next four talks, we're going to look at a third reason why Jesus instituted the Eucharist, and that was to give to the Church a perfect sacrifice to offer to the Lord. And this is it's not the least of the three reasons. But in people's minds, I think it's the least of the three reasons, if it's present at all. And I think if we were to do a survey and ask Catholics, why did Jesus institute the Eucharist? I don't think many Catholics would say, to give us His perfect sacrifice. And so what we want to do today is look at why that's important and what's the big deal. And hopefully come to see how central the sacrificial dimension is. All right, so sacrifice of the Mass. And we talked about this in the spring because we looked at the Old Testament figures of the Eucharist. And so we had a whole lecture on all the Old Testament sacrifices and how they prefigured the Mass as sacrifice. So above all, the Passover lamb, but all the sacrifice in the temple, the lamb offered every morning and evening, and all the other sacrifices of the different feasts, the Day of Atonement, etc. All right, so now we're going to presuppose that, but look more deeply. What is a sacrifice? Why do we need sacrifice? And what makes this sacrifice the only perfect sacrifice? Okay. And keep in mind, so in the next talk, we're going to look at the objections, because our Protestant brethren, Protestants usually aren't united on theological matters, right? Because there are lots of 10,000 different denominations with all kinds of different views. But here's something they're all united on. The Mass is not a sacrifice, and to say it's a sacrifice is practically blasphemous. Right? So we want to understand why it's not blasphemous, and in fact why it's the most beautiful thing. Okay. So in order to do this, we have to look a little at what religion is about. So the word religion, the etymology of it is helpful. So it comes from the Latin, re is again, and the religion part comes, it seems the best explanation is from to bind. Ligare is to bind. That's where we get the word, like other words in English. And so religion means to bind back, to bind us back to God. Right? And we bind ourselves back to God by giving Him the honor that's due to Him. Right? So basically, the virtue of religion is part of justice. Justice is to give to everyone their due. And there's a justice with our neighbor, right? A justice with our parents, our children, but there's also a justice with our Creator and Lord. And that's to give Him an honor proper to Him as our Creator and our Father. Right? And so that's the virtue of religion. The virtue by which we'll give to God an honor that's due to Him for who He is. Okay? Our Creator and Redeemer. And so what's due to God? Well, love, first of all, because of who He is. Gratitude for all that He's done for us. Right? So obviously praise and honor go together with that love. So love, praise, and honor. Gratitude for His gifts. Gratitude and thanksgiving. it's due to him that we ask him. So even prayer and petition is due to God because it shows him to be the giver of all gifts. So when we ask for things, we're giving him honor, right, by addressing him as the one who can provide. And then once sin has entered the world, something else is due, and that is an expression of contrition and an attempt to make satisfaction for sin. Right. Sacrifice attempts to do all of those things. Right? So the reason that all the cultures of the world have known to offer some kind of sacrifice, even if a perverse one, such as human sacrifice, nevertheless, the cultures of the world, the religions of the world, got this right, that we need to give God an honor that goes to him for who he is, that's different from any other honor, and that it needs to be visibly manifested. And we might ask, well, why is that? He's spiritual. Why do we need to make visible the honor that we give to God? Well, we're not purely spiritual. We've got bodies and senses, and so it's natural for man to externally represent what happens inside. And if we didn't do that, we wouldn't be acting in a properly human way. Right? We express love to our spouses and children and parents, better be externally as well as interiorly. And the external is the sign or symbol of the internal. Right? And if we do that with our loved ones on earth, we should do it to God too. Right? And so that's what sacrifice is. The offering of something sensible, visible, to God alone as a token of the honor that's due to him alone as our Creator and Redeemer. All right? And if sin hadn't entered the world, it would just be to show him that honor. But since there is sin, sacrifice also has another purpose, to make satisfaction for sinning against him and to seek his forgiveness. Okay? So we could say there are four purposes for which sacrifice is offered. To praise and adore him, to thank him, to accompany our petitions, and to make reparation or satisfaction or atonement for sin. Okay? The external always has to reflect the internal. That's true of everything in religion, all of the liturgy. The external part of the liturgy better be the reflection of the interior offering. And it's that way in sacrifice too. Right? So we can speak of an invisible sacrifice, and Psalm 51, the Psalm of David, says that it's a contrite heart. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Right? So in every sacrifice, say whether it was the sacrifices of Israel, the sacrifices of pagan peoples, or the sacrifice of the church, that's what it represents. Right? That honor and adoration, praise, thanksgiving, petition, and contrition for sin. And to do this, the peoples of the world understood that you had to show that unique honor. The fitting way to do that was to give to the Lord something exterior to be a sign of the interior gift. Right? So the gift that God principally wants is the heart undivided, right? The whole heart. But we express that by giving something else externally. Right? And so Israel and the nations gave to the Lord things that were precious to them, and above all, living things or things that are for human nourishment. Right? And so their livestock, lambs, goats, bulls, oxen, or bread and wine offerings, right, were offered to the Lord. And by being offered, they were subtracted from ordinary human use, given to the Lord to show that he now has dominion over them. And putting them into his dominion sanctified what was being offered. And the sign of that sanctification was putting it on the altar. Right? So the altar, right, and it's that way here too in our church, the altar is the sign of God's receiving the gift that is offered in sacrifice. Right? So the altar has a deep meaning. It's precisely God's dominion. What's placed on the altar becomes His. That's true. It was true in Israel, and it's true in the Mass as well. And so, if we look at human cultures, we see that almost all cultures offer sacrifice of some kind, or at least did until the secular modernity. And we can see from that there's something, if a custom is universal, such as, say, I don't know, the knowledge of the Golden Rule, we can explain that by saying, well, it's universal because it's written on the heart. And here too, because from the universality of sacrifice in human cultures, we can see that this is something that's part of natural law. And in fact, that's how Thomas Aquinas analyzes sacrifice. It's something that's written on the heart, like giving to each one their due. Giving to God his due is equally written on the heart as giving to my neighbor his due, or paying taxes, or paying one's employee, etc. But the ways that it's done, that's not determined. Right? And so God in Israel gave a specific way in which sacrifices were to be offered as part of the Mosaic law. Right? And that was a great gift of God, that He spelled out how He wanted to be worshipped. But in any case, what's written on the heart is simply that something needs to be offered for those four purposes, and that it needs to be something of great value. Right? And so we subtract something from our own use that represents, in a sense, everything. Right? So what is a sacrifice? Something that is done and offered to God. So, in the Old Covenant, animals were slain, the blood poured out, the bread broken, blessed, etc. And all of those things to show that they were being given to God. So offered to God, and then deprived of taken away from our own secular use. Right? And so in the case of, the Paschal Lamb, blood is poured out. Right? It's taken away from our use, given to God. But then the beautiful thing is that God gives it back. And so the Passover lamb, it's given first to God, slaughtered in the temple court, sacrificed to the temple court on the 14th of Nisan. But then that same evening, each family received it back to be their nourishment. Right? And of course, the same thing happens in the Eucharist, but on a higher level. Okay. All right. So why is that necessary? Well, I think we've seen why it's necessary. It's necessary to show this honor to God and to express it in a human way, and that it's necessary that it be something significant, something to show the wholeness of the gift of the heart that needs to be given. Right? And then to make satisfaction for sin, here's the problem. To make satisfaction for sin, the offering to be a perfect sacrifice, the thing offered should be more pleasing than the sin is displeasing. Right? To make satisfaction, in order to restore equality, what we would have to do would be to offer something better than sin is bad. All right, there's a problem here. Right? Nothing finite that we offer is better than sin is bad. And that's because sin has a certain infinite dimension. We don't like to talk about that, but the fact is, an offense is bad according to the dignity of the person offended, right? So every offense to a human being is on a totally different order than an offense to an animal, right? Because of human dignity. So there's an immeasurable gap there. But if we offend, say, a president or a pope, we can see that it's worse, because if I offend, say, our president, I've offended the whole nation. And if I offend, say, the Pope, I've offended the church. All right, what happens when you offend God? You offend one of infinite dignity, but not only that, you offend Him who's given us everything that we have. and so it's a sin of ingratitude as well. So every sin has a certain infinite dimension, even though obviously we don't think about that when we do it. And so there's a problem, how to make satisfaction. So we want to offer something, and so the symbolic sacrifices represent making amends, atonement, but they don't actually accomplish it. But it's still better to give them than not to give them, because at least they're the symbols of the contrition of the heart. Right? So the sacrifice of Israel didn't fully make atonement, right? In fact, it fell how short? Infinitely short. And it didn't matter how many you multiply. Right? 50,000 paschal lambs still falls infinitely short. But it's good still, right? And so the sacrifices of Israel were very good because they represented the need to make satisfaction and restore that honor. Right? And it's interesting that the ordinary way that that sacrifice was done was by pouring out the blood. Right? And that's deeply symbolic. It's showing that, because the blood, for the cultures of the world, represents the life. And for us too, we speak of life, our lifeblood. And so the blood represents the life or the soul. And so the sacrificing of a sacrificial animal and pouring the blood out onto the altar is a way of saying all life comes from the Lord. He has dominion over this, and we return it to Him as a sign of the more that we ought to give Him if we could. All right? So in Israel and in the culture of the world, the blood was poured out for God as a sign of His being the source of life and of all good. And it said in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22, unless blood is shed, there can be no remission of sins. But again, the problem is the blood of lambs and bulls and goats, etc., doesn't reestablish equality. Right? And so the sacrifice of Israel we saw earlier, last spring, were figures of a better sacrifice. A better sacrifice that devout Israelites would have longed for. A messianic sacrifice, a sacrifice that would so cover sin that one wouldn't need to add anything else to it. But the sacrifices of Israel weren't like that, because one had to repeat them and offer a new one each year. Right? They had to be continually multiplied, showing their insufficiency. So the letter to the Hebrews speaks about that, for example, in chapter 10. The law of Moses, has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities. And it can never, by the same sacrifices, which are offered year after year, make perfect those who draw near. For it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Right? Because the less can't do the more. Right? The blood of bulls and goats is less than we are, and in some sense, our sin is in some way greater, because it's greater than our power to undo. Right? So the lesser can't take away the greater, even if we multiply it to the 100,000s. But it was still very good, right? That sacrifice was very good because it showed the need for redemption. And the greatest tragedy in Israel's life was the loss of the ability to make that sacrifice when the temple was destroyed. First, the destruction of the first temple when they were taken to Babylon, and then in the year 70 AD, the destruction of the temple, the second temple, never to be rebuilt. And Jews mourn that every year on the ninth day of the Jewish month of Av. That's July? In the summer sometime. And but that liturgy was very good, even though today it's no longer accomplished, right? Because all the sacrifices of Israel had to be done in the temple court. And since that temple no longer stands, none of them can be offered. And that's the reason why the sacrifices of the Mosaic Law are no longer offered for the last 19 centuries. Okay. Now, in the offering of sacrifice, the key thing to see is that there's an upward direction. Now, religion involves two directions, right? Because religion is binding ourselves back to God. And so to bind ourselves back, we need to offer Him things. We offer Him sacrifice. Sorry. That's not better. Anyway, we offer to God sacrifice, and He gives us blessings and grace. So we've got two directions. The upward direction, by which we offer to God something finite, the sacrifices of Israel and the nations, and He gives us something that is immeasurable, a share in His life, forgiveness of sins. And so religion always involves those two directions, and mediate priestly. So let's look now at the priest. When there's sacrifice, there has to be a priest. And again, the cultures of the world understood this, that a priest is one who offers sacrifice. And so the letter to the Hebrews, again, speaks about that the priest, chapter 5, verse 1, every high priest chosen among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. Right? So the priest is a mediator to act on behalf of all men in society in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin, and to win, therefore, blessings, grace, and the forgiveness of sins. I'm on page 6, by the way, if you're following. So the priesthood, is linked to sacrifice. The priest is the one who offers sacrifice. And this sacrifice, we can say, is an us-sending movement, us-sending mediation, to win God's descending blessings. Right? And so, think of it, Noah. Noah makes it, after the flood, the first thing that Noah does is what? That we read about. Offer sacrifice. So you offer, and that's why he had to take 7 of the clean animals, even though just 2 of the unclean animals, because the clean animals were the ones offered in sacrifice. So he took 7 of them so that he could have animals to sacrifice after the flood, to thank God for deliverance. And so Noah offers that, and Scripture says that it was a pleasing odor to the Lord. Pleasing not because he eats those sacrifices, obviously, but pleasing because it shows man's doing what he was made to do, right? Honoring and thanking the Lord. And so God blessed Noah and gave the promise that never again would the world be destroyed in that way. Right? So that shows us the structure of sacrifice. It's offered to make propitiation for sin and win God's favor and blessing. So that's priestly mediation. The mediator, so the priest, stands between. Right? Stands between God and the people. Mediating in this dual way. So sacrifice is the ascending direction, and the other sacraments are the descending direction. Right? So in the life of the church, we have both directions. God's blessings come through baptism, confirmation, etc., Holy Communion. But the sacrifice is the Eucharist. Right? And so the Eucharist most perfectly realizes both forms of mediation, ascending and descending. Right? The Eucharist does what all those other sacrifices couldn't do. So in the other sacrifice, something was offered that was less than sin is bad, right? Less good than sin is bad. In the Eucharist, we offer Christ, who is more good than all sin put together is bad. And therefore, in every Mass, so on Calvary, Christ offered himself, right, on the cross, and thus offered something more pleasing, laying down his life, for restoring the glory of his Father and the forgiveness of our sins. Right? So Christ sacrificed himself for that dual end: the glory of God, his Father, and the forgiveness of human sin. In every Mass, what is being offered? That same Jesus. So we have the same victim, and we have the same priest. Jesus, there's a ministerial priest, but the real priest, the principal priest in every Mass, is Jesus. Right? So in every Mass, we have that same offering being made that was made on Calvary. Right? And therefore, in every Mass, we have an infinite offering, and we have the winning of incalculable blessings, because, above all, Holy Communion. And so we receive that same Lord that was offered. Right? So the Passover lamb is similar. Right? The Passover lamb was first sacrificed and then received as a sign of God's blessing. But the difference is that what was offered then was just a lamb, and what's offered now is the Lord made flesh, loving us to the end, right? Having loved us to the death. Right, so let's look. The sacrifice of Calvary, therefore, realizes perfectly everything that all the sacrifices of human history could only point to. And its perfection comes from three things. So the sacrifice of Calvary was perfect because of the dignity of the victim that was offered. God made man. From the dignity of the priest who offered it, the same Jesus, right, who freely, because he's offering it because he didn't have to die. No, he says to, couldn't I send 20 legions of angels? Right? I lay down my life and I take it up again. So he freely gave himself because as God incarnate, he had the divine omnipotence at his disposal to avoid death, if he so chose. And therefore the fact that he didn't choose to avoid death shows that he freely laid it down. Right? And then there was that beautiful dialogue in Gethsemane, and that's why he didn't want the disciples to be sleeping, because he wanted them to hear those words, not my will, but your will be done. Again, to show that he freely gave himself. Right? So we've got the sacrifice of Calvary comes from the victim, Christ, from the priest, Christ, and from the love that motivated the offering, Christ's love. And so all three are infinite. The dignity of the victim is God incarnate, the dignity of the priest, the same God incarnate, and the love is the love of the heart of Jesus, which is unlimited. Okay? So the sacrifice of Calvary was perfect. And a beautiful thing about the sacrifice of Calvary is that there's a total unity. In all the sacrifices of Israel, the lamb, say, offered was one thing, the priest was another, the sins were another, the sins of the people, and God was another. So one thing was offered, another offered it. It was offered on behalf of another, the sins of the people, and it was offered to God. In the case of Calvary, the victim is the same God for whom it's offered. The priest is again the same as the victim. Right? So the victim and priest are one. Right? That's in all the sacrifices of Israel, that could never be the case. Not even in the sacrifice of Abraham, the sacrifice of Isaac, could the victim and the priest be the same. But on Calvary, they were the same. And then he made himself one with the people by taking on our nature. So when God, the second person of the Trinity, became man, he put himself in solidarity with all men, becoming our new head, the new Adam. And therefore he made himself one with those for whom he came to expiate sin. So the victim the priest, God to whom it's offered, and us are in a sense all made one. Now, obviously Jesus and us are distinct in some sense. He's Jesus and we're not. But he made himself our head, and he's making us into his body. And so we are one as members of his body. And so the sacrifice of Calvary had this perfect unity. And thus, it perfectly accomplished everything that sacrifice was ever meant to accomplish. All right, here's the objection. If that's the case, if Calvary did everything, why do we still need a sacrifice? Maybe the most logical thing would be to think, well, sacrifice is now done. After Calvary, sacrifice is accomplished, and we don't need to offer it anymore. What's that? Okay, there's a problem. We keep sinning. That's one problem. But even that, somebody could answer, it's true we keep on sinning, but Jesus back on Calvary offered something then that was great enough to more than compensate for all sin, no matter how long the world lasts. And that's true. Okay. So, and in fact, this is precisely the argument that Protestants make, right? That Calvary did it all, and sacrifice is finished. All right, what's the matter with that? Remember, let's go back to the beginning. We said that religion, so for St. Thomas Aquinas and the great theologians, religion is actually a virtue. It's a virtue related to justice, the virtue by which we give to God his due. Even though we can't. So I should rephrase that. It's the virtue by which we try to give to God his due, even though we fall infinitely short by ourselves. But we still have to try, even though by ourselves we'll fall short. Because otherwise it would be not trying to honor him at all. Right? So, and we saw that sacrifice was a privileged way of giving him that honor. An honor that's due only to him. That's, by the way, that's why sacrifice can only be offered to God. If it's offered to anyone else, say Caesar, that's idolatry. In other words, that's giving an honor due exclusively to our Creator and Redeemer to a creature. And so sacrifice is given to give this. Okay, so I think we can see from this why we can't say sacrifice is done. Because we still need to do this. Even though Christ did it perfectly, we, individually and collectively, as the church, still need to honor God. And Jesus knows that by ourselves, we will fall infinitely short. And so therefore, a great, great, great gift was giving to us the ability to offer something to God that actually is due to him. And so in the last night of his life, Jesus gave to the church a great gift. And so the first thing we think of, he gave the gift of himself, absolutely true. He gave the gift of himself to us, not just to have in our midst, but to receive into our bodies. But he also gave us the gift of being able to make a gift. And that's not the least of his gifts. Right? Because when you think about it, the best gift you can give to a person who's needy is the ability to regain their dignity by being able to give back. And by being able to give back in a unique way. And so Jesus does that to us, and he did that on the last night of his life, Holy Thursday. Right? So he gave to the church a perfect sacrifice that wouldn't fall short. In other words, would actually be an external sacrifice in which what we offer is due to God, is proportionate to God's own goodness. Because we're giving God the Father, God the Son. And not only proportionate to God, but proportionate and more than superabundantly proportionate to human sin. So he gave to us a sacrifice that we could offer, by which what we offer is more pleasing to God than sin is displeasing. It's true, he already offered it. But he wanted us to be able to offer it too. Right? So basically that's the reason why Jesus instituted the Mass, the principal reason, was this: to give us, his church, something to offer throughout the life of his church and wherever his church is found, wherever his bride is found, through history and space. I want you to hold it for the end. Okay. All right? And the Council of Trent speaks about this in a very beautiful way. Right? Because Martin Luther, John Calvin, all the Protestants agreed in saying that the Mass can't be a sacrifice, and to say that it's a sacrifice is to denigrate the sacrifice of Calvary. And so the Council of Trent, which was called to give a response to the Protestant Reformation, explains why that argument doesn't work. In other words, why the Mass doesn't denigrate Calvary. So it says, He, our Lord and God, who was once and for all to offer himself by his death on the altar of the cross. Right? So on Calvary, the cross was the altar. So on the altar of the cross, he offered himself on Good Friday, and to accomplish an everlasting redemption. But death was not to end his priesthood. Right? Because Jesus is the eternal high priest. He's priest because we said a priest is a mediator, stands in the middle between God. Well, Jesus, in his humanity, the humanity of Jesus stands in the middle because it's the humanity of God the Son. It's the humanity of God, but it's humanity that he shares with us. So Jesus is the one and only perfect mediator by virtue of his two natures. Consubstantial with his Father in divinity and consubstantial with us in his humanity. Right? So Jesus is a priest not just for a day, not just for Good Friday, but Jesus is a priest forever because of who he is. So, death was not to end his priesthood. And so at the Last Supper, on the night in which he was betrayed, in order to leave his beloved spouse, the church, a sacrifice that was visible, as the nature of man demands, right? When 4 centuries ago, the Council of Trent thought that people could understand that. But today I think we need to work to help people to see why the nature of man demands a sacrifice. But that's what we've tried to do up till now. Right? The nature of man demands it because God, human nature demands that we give an honor to God that's due to him, and that we represent it externally. And so, as the nature of man demands, so Jesus, declaring himself constituted a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, offered his body and blood under the appearances of bread and wine, to God the Father. So he offered them to God the Father, and he gave his body and blood under the same appearances, under the same species, to the apostles to receive. So notice there's a double giving. I think often people lose sight of this, I think, in the Mass. We think that the Mass is a giving to us, simply. Right? Jesus gave his body and blood to us. True. But first, it's given to the Father. Right? That's why there's the elevation in the Mass. So, the Council says, he offered his body and blood to God the Father, and then he gave his body and blood to the apostles to receive, making them priests of the new covenant at the same time when he said, do this in remembrance of me. Right? This sacrifice was to represent meaning not theatrically, a theatrical representation, but literally represent, make present again, to make present anew this bloody sacrifice which he accomplished on the cross once and for all. And he ordered the apostles and their successors in the priesthood to offer this same sacrifice when he said, do this. In other words, what he had just done in remembrance of me. Right? So, on Holy Thursday, Jesus anticipated the same act that he was to accomplish the following day. But he did it in a different it was offered in a different mode or way. All right, so let's look at that for a second. He did the same thing because he offered the same victim. Right? When he said, "This is my body, this is my blood," he was present there on the table of the Last Supper, and he offered himself to his Father. So it was the same victim offered, same priest doing the offering, the same love motivating the offering, and what he offered was precisely that blood which was about to be poured out physically the next day. But in the Last Supper, he didn't pour it out physically, he gave it sacramentally. So the Council of Trent speaks of an unbloody sacrifice, Holy Thursday, and a bloody sacrifice, Good Friday. But there's blood in both, right? In Holy Thursday there was his blood in the chalice. It's just that his blood couldn't be physically separated because he was still alive. The blood would be physically separated only the next day when he was flogged and crucified and when his side was pierced. All right? So the Council of Trent is saying that he gave us this same sacrifice to us as his gift because our nature demands, it's necessary for human nature that we offer something to God. And so he gave us the most perfect thing that even God could think of to offer to God. In other words, even God, with all his wisdom and omnipotence, couldn't come up with a better thing to be offered to him than what Jesus instituted in the Mass, in Holy Thursday, in the Last Supper. Because what was given was the same God, but in a different person. God the Son offering himself in the human nature, right? He could only offer himself in human nature, and that's a fundamental reason why God became man. So that in that humanity that he took on from us, he could offer himself to the end for us. And so what's offered has the dignity. So just as we said, when you offend God, the offense has the dignity according to the person that you offend. When you make an act of reparation, the act of reparation has the dignity of the one offering. All right, when Jesus offers himself, that offering has the dignity of the one offered, Jesus, and of the one offering, Jesus, the same Jesus. And he gives us that perfect sacrifice so we can offer something than which even God couldn't give us anything better to offer. Okay? So, the key point here is the Mass is a sacrifice. Why? Because essentially the exact same thing happens in every Mass as happened on Good Friday, with one exception. In every Mass, we have the same victim, the same priest, principal priest, right? There's also a human minister, but the principal priest is Jesus. We have the same love of Jesus that's motivating it. That doesn't go away. And we have the same intention in offering it for the remission of the sins of the world and to win from his Father every good gift. Right? So every Mass is the same essentially as Calvary because the same thing is given. And this presupposes, though, what we did last spring, the real presence. In other words, Jesus the reason why we have the same sacrifice is because at the words of the priest, "This is my body," what was bread becomes his body. And what was wine becomes his blood. So that on the altar we have the same victim today as on Good Friday, just as there was the same victim the night before at the Last Supper. Okay? Now, we might ask, well, what's this unbloody mode? So it's essentially the same sacrifice, but we said there's a difference. On Calvary, the sacrifice involved his death. But in the Mass, he dies no more. Right? So the Mass differs from Calvary in that it doesn't involve a new death, right? Because Jesus rose never to die again. But Jesus found a way by which his death could be represented, and the power of his death, the blessings won by his death, be made present. And that way is the double consecration. Now, we know that it's not necessary to receive communion under both species. We'll look at this later. Because the whole of Jesus is contained under either species. Why do I say that now? Because today, Jesus has risen. So when those words are said, "This is my body," that body that's made present on the altar is the body of Jesus glorified, who dies no more, and therefore has a body also full of blood, and his soul animating it. If Mass had been celebrated on Holy Saturday, right, it wasn't. But let's just suppose that Holy Saturday, Peter had celebrated Mass. Right? There's no record of this. The body, so at those words, "This is my body," it would have been his body separate from his soul, separate from his blood, because at his death all three had come apart. Body and blood got separated at his death. That was the bloody sacrifice by which his blood was physically separated from his body, and his soul was separated from both. But his divinity wasn't separated from any. Right? So it was still the body of God and the blood of God and the soul of God, but all three come apart. Easter Sunday, what happened? All three come back together, never to be separated again. So we can't physically separate his body and his blood anymore, such that we can have his body separate from his blood. And of course we wouldn't want to, because that would mean his death. Yeah. But Jesus gave us a way to represent that. And that's the reason why he instituted the Eucharist under two species. The species of bread and wine, making present his body and his blood. Because that represents sacramentally what physically happened on Calvary. So in every Mass, the double consecration, first of his body and then of his blood, sacramentally represents his death. Represents what physically got separated on Calvary. But we can't kill him anew. And so the sacrifice that's offered today is unbloody. It has his blood, but not in physical separation from his body. All right? But nevertheless, the sacrifice, the moment of sacrifice, is precisely the dual consecration, by which on the altar we make his body and blood present separately under distinct species. Right? That's the moment of sacrifice. And that's why a Mass can never be celebrated just under one species. So, suppose, I don't know, you're in a concentration camp, a priest, and the priest has only bread. Can he celebrate Mass? No. If he has only wine, can he celebrate Mass? No. There have to be both species. Tiny, doesn't matter how much, but there has to be both so that it makes present his sacrifice. Okay? So I've given you a text of Pius XII from 1947, and he speaks about this. So he says, the sacrifice, this is bottom page 9, the sacrifice of the altar is no empty commemoration of the passion and death of Christ, but a true and proper act of sacrifice, whereby the high priest, Jesus, by an unbloody immolation, right, he doesn't die again, offers himself a most acceptable victim to the eternal Father, as he did upon the cross. We've got the same victim, the same priest. All right? The priest is the same, Jesus Christ, whose sacred person his minister represents. And therefore the priest in his priestly activity, in a certain manner, lends his tongue and gives his hand to Christ. What a beautiful expression. All right? So that's why a priest is ordained principally for that. To lend his tongue to Jesus at the center of the Mass in the words of consecration, and to lend him his hands. So that Jesus can act as the eternal high priest today, tomorrow, until his second coming. All right? And so the priest is the same, the victim is the same, but the manner in which Christ is offered is different. On the cross, he completely offered himself and all his sufferings to God, and it was brought about by his bloody death, which he underwent by his free will. But on the altar, by reason of the glorified state of his humanity now, death has no more dominion over him. And so the shedding of blood physically is impossible. Right? Still, according to the plan of the divine wisdom, the sacrifice of our Redeemer is shown forth in an admirable manner by external signs. Right? The separate consecration of first his body and then his blood. For by transubstantiation of bread into the body and of wine into his body and blood are both really present. Right? And they symbolize the actual separation that occurred on Good Friday. Thus, that actual separation is represented in every sacrifice of the altar. Right? In other words, in every Mass. Let me see if I can explain this now in my own words. So what we're saying is every Mass is essentially the same as Calvary because something is being offered to God. Something is being put in his dominion. And what's being put there? Jesus Christ. By the same act by which he gave himself 2,000 years ago. In other words, Jesus doesn't retract that yes that he gave in Gethsemane. And so the offering is a perpetual offering. And it's the same, the letter to Hebrews says, yesterday, today, and forever. Right? So the interior oblation is the same. What's being offered is the same. Jesus. Priest is the same. But there's one thing that's not the same, and that is his physical death. Okay? And so what do we have in the Mass? We have something being offered of infinite value, our Savior, given to us to offer, and we'll see in the following talks, we're called to add something to it. And that something is our own sacrifice. And so that'll be 2 talks from now. The 4th talk, we'll look at that. The participation of the faithful in the sacrifice. And so Jesus is giving us his sacrifice to offer, but there's a condition. We can only rightly offer it if it represents the interior offering of our hearts. Right? Because we said that's what a sacrifice is. It's the external offering of something that represents the interior offering. And so Christ is giving us his perfect exterior sacrifice, and he's offering himself interiorly, but we have to offer ourselves together with him. And that'll be a whole talk on that. One last point. Christ's sacrifice transcends time. All right, he died 2,000 years ago, dies no more, but nevertheless, that event of Good Friday is an event that transcends all time, different than other events. Right? Other events, sure, every event of history is eternally present to God. But not every event of history has infinite consequences. The event of Good Friday has infinite consequences, right? Because an infinite gift was given such that it has a power to extend over all time. And so Jesus, should we put this? Yes, the sacrifice of Calvary had power to be enough, to be sufficient in itself. But he wanted that power to be represented by it being offered every day. In other words, the fact that the Mass offers the same thing that was offered then gives more dignity to what was then offered. Because it shows, it manifests that his offering is the center not only of human history, but of each one of our lives and the life of the church. In other words, Jesus wanted that central event of all history, right? Not chronologically, we don't know what's the center of history. I guess that was a long time ago, given how many billions of years the universe has been about. But the center of human history and of, we could say, all of history in its meaning is Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. And therefore, he wanted that event to be central in everyone's life. And thus, an event that's never celebrated or never participated in can't be central to our lives. And so he wanted the Mass to make Calvary present in our world until the end of time. And also he wanted it to apply the fruits of Calvary. And that we'll look at in 2 weeks, the fruits of the Mass. All right, so Christ's sacrifice transcends time. The Catechism talks about this nicely in 1085. It says, his Paschal event, mystery, is a real event. Right? It occurred in our history. But it is unique. All other historical events happen once and then they pass away, swallowed up in the past. But the Paschal mystery of Christ, by contrast, cannot remain only in the past, because by his death he destroyed death. And all that Christ is, all that he did and suffered for men, participates in the divine eternity. But especially that act, right? If we could say his whole earthly life participated in divine eternity, especially the culminating act of his life, in which, in a sense, we could say included everything else that he did, right? Got summed up on Calvary. So the event of the cross and resurrection abides and draws everything towards life. And the Mass is given to us to help that to abide, as it were, to make it abide also in this form of giving us something that we can offer to God that is the same as what he offered 2,000 years ago. And then the last reflection here, the Mass, the Mass is inexhaustible, it contains infinite riches, and a beautiful thing about the Mass is that it contains the whole, we said in some sense the whole of his life, but the whole of his Paschal mystery. What is that? The Mass in some sense contains his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. How can we see that? Well, it contains his death because it makes that sacrifice of Calvary present today. It contains his resurrection because the Christ that comes in the Mass, that's made present, is in fact the risen Christ. Right? Christ comes in the Mass as he is today. And today he's risen and ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father, from where he intercedes for us. And so the Mass makes him present also in the mystery of his risen life and ascension. All right? And so it sums up everything. And so the letter to the Hebrews says, having ascended, he is able for all time to save those who draw near to him, who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for us. But again, the beauty of the Mass is he lives to make intercession for us in such a way that he enables us to offer precisely that sacrifice of intercession and to be co-authors of it. Okay? So let's take our break here, and then we'll have questions and answers after.